shot size comes from either the distance between us and the characters or from the focal length. Focal length, or zoom, is the angle of view. In this oversimplified drawing, light enters the lens and is projected onto a frame of 35mm film. When we zoom in, what we're really doing is moving the lens further away from the film, which narrows the angle of view. So this is called a long lens. A wide angle is created by moving the lens closer, which widens the angle of view. So this is called a short lens. If we're fairly close to the character with a short lens, we can produce the same shot size by setting up the camera further back and using a longer lens. As we cut between these two cameras, the shot size is identical, but the perspective is very different. Focal length makes an enormous difference in the relative sizes of characters or objects. Here we're in a regular over the shoulder, but as we pull back and zoom in, the perspective becomes much flatter and the characters seem to have the same size. This is called compression of space and is as fundamental a choice as shot size. In the closer shot with the wide lens, the distance between the characters is the same as the distance from the red man to the camera. But with the camera further back and a longer lens, the distance between the characters is only a fraction of the distance to the camera. So in comparison to the distance to the camera, the distance between the characters is almost nothing. The first thing focal length does is control the closeness between the characters. This is a sliding scale. If we zoom out and move closer, the characters seem further apart. If we move far back and zoom in, the characters seem closer together. Secondly, it allows us to see the world in a different way than the human eye does. If we want a shot to look like reality, we'll use a lens that has the same angle of view as the human eye, which on 35mm film is around 50mm. But we make shots much more interesting by deliberately staying away from lenses that mimic the human eye. Here we're using a 25mm lens, which creates more distance between everything in the scene and the illusion of a larger location. Here we're using a 120mm lens, which creates a tighter atmosphere and singles out the characters we're interested in. Being wider or longer than reality is the easiest way to create production value because the image becomes an interpretation instead of a recording. Thirdly, long focal lengths suppress our understanding of the layout of the scene, which can be an effective storytelling tool. Here we're using a regular lens, and it's very easy to make out the spatial relationships between the characters. Here we're further back using a 200mm lens, which flattens the perspective and makes the layout of the scene harder to understand. This either makes the situation more disorienting, or it makes us single out in arbitrary surroundings. Disorientation is sometimes a goal because the scene loses its mystique as soon as we know the entire layout. In choosing focal lengths for normal dialogue, a regular lens tends to create too much difference in size between the characters. If we pull back and use a longer lens, the sizes of the characters even out more, and the atmosphere becomes more intimate. So the over-the-shoulder is really out here. In close-ups, a regular lens can put us uncomfortably close to the character, and it can feel like we're shooting up her nose. So we'll again make the shot slightly longer from further back, giving us a flatter perspective and a more forgiving shot. Cutting back and forth between the two versions, the difference in perspective is very clear. This puts the close-up by the blue woman's shoulder, so we'll sometimes need to cheat her position. Cutting between cameras that have very different focal lengths usually doesn't work well. As we cut from a regular lens to a long one, the mood changes very abruptly, which is more apparent in live action than on a simple 3D set. As we pan with the characters in a very tight shot with a long lens, the cut to a regular lens seems strange because we're cutting from a compressed and intimate shot to an ordinary one. The exception to this is that shorter lenses come more naturally to wider shots because we want to capture more of the scene. And longer lenses come more naturally to closer shots because our goal is to become more involved. So going from a master that might be a 30mm to get more of the scene, the cut to an 80mm close-up doesn't feel like a sudden change in focal length because it happens for a reason. It's really not necessary to go around thinking in millimeters, except to remember that 50mm is about the same as the human eye, that higher numbers are longer and lower numbers are shorter. But it's useful to notice that the angle of view skyrockets as the lens becomes shorter, so there's an enormous difference between a 20mm lens and a 10, but almost no difference between a 190mm and a 200.